All right, good morning, everyone. This is Louise Savela again with Rails. I am a consulting and continuing education specialist, and I thank you all for joining in on our webinar today called Autism 101 for Libraries with Mary O'Brien from Illinois State University. Before I turn things over to her, I just want to make a few technical announcements. Everybody in the audience is muted today, so you don't need a microphone to participate. Just sit back and listen. If you have any questions, there is a questions box on your control panel. You can type your questions in there. I will be keeping an eye on questions, and at certain points throughout the presentation, Mary will be taking a break and we'll discuss questions at that time. Your control panel is usually on the right side of your screen. It has an orange arrow, which is called a grab tag. You can click that orange arrow to open or close your control panel if you need to get it out of the way. We are recording the session today. Thank you so much to Mary for allowing us to do that. We'll post that on the Rails website next week sometime. And Mary has provided some handouts. There is a handouts section on your control panel. If you click the plus sign next to handouts, you'll see 3 items there that Mary shared and then one that I shared. This program is part of our series of programs to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we have several more webinars and events coming up between now and December. So you'll find those 4 handouts there. So I think that's all I have for my announcements. So I'm going to turn things over to Mary. Good morning, Mary.
Good morning, Louise. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you okay.
Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the presentation.
Yep,
and
I can see it. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
I'll need to close the window first. There you go. All right. Welcome, everybody. The presentation Autism 101 for Librarians. Today, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join me in talking about a really important topic and embedded within the larger, really important topic of celebrating the Americans with Disabilities Act. I appreciate Rails for hosting this event and for working with folks to try to raise awareness and help us all work toward all people enjoying the great services that are available at our libraries. My goal today is to present to you some information. Some may be confirmatory for some of you, things you've heard before, information that you know, and that's great. And then discuss some implications about how we can support families, people with autism and families, so that they can enjoy the library. I wanted to give you a little bit about my background just so you know my perspective and what I bring to this topic. My first introduction to people with disabilities was my birth, because I happened to be born into a family with a member with disabilities. My older brother has multiple disabilities. Some would say if he were born now, he would be classified as a person with autism. He does not have that diagnosis. He has the diagnosis of developmental disabilities, but has a lot of characteristics of folks with autism. And I'll be sharing some of my experiences with him so that you can understand kind of how things apply in the real world. I think because of him, I was very focused on working with people with disabilities, and so my undergraduate is in teaching special education, and I've worked with agencies, adult populations, preschool, children, so I've worked with all ages of people with disabilities in various settings, but primarily my work has been in schools, in the K-12 or pre-K-12 space, and so that's where I draw a lot of my experiences as well. So with that background, we'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to start with this quote that a child is not ignoring you, that they're waiting for you to enter their world. And we're going to draw upon this quote as we move through the morning, discussing the underlying thoughts of that. And we'll talk about characteristics of autism and how we can engage people with autism based on some tools and tips. So that said, the agenda for today, we've done a little bit of introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about basic facts. You've probably heard these facts. It's good to get those as a foundation when we move forward because we want to know how we can best help people with autism. After we look at some basic facts, some characteristics about people with autism, then we'll look at those tips or those tools for working with children and adults actually with autism. I did ask some parents to provide some input in terms of what would they want to say to library staff about working with their family members, and so we're going to share a little bit of those and then talk about environmental supports that we can think about for our space and then take questions. As Louise said, I'm going to stop in the middle and see if you have any questions. She's going to help me with that today, and then we'll have time at the end for questions as well. So with that, as a backdrop to what we're going to talk about today, I just want to bring out the incidence or the prevalence of autism. So according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the incidence of autism has risen steadily and dramatically in the past 2 decades. So for example, in the year 2000, 1 in 1,000 children were identified as having autism spectrum disorder. Currently, that prevalence rate is 1 in 68. So within the last 15 years, you can see the dramatic increase in the prevalence of autism spectrum disorders. This increase is likely due to several factors. We're better at diagnosing autism in younger and younger children, and looking at the characteristics of older adults and saying, those characteristics, even if they weren't identified as a toddler or as a young child, they have those characteristics and fit the description of autism spectrum disorders. More awareness, just like this program is, there's a lot more awareness of autism and the characteristics of autism and working with people with autism spectrum disorder. And then many researchers are coming to believe that there is an actual increase in the population that has autism. So those factors all combined to result in that dramatic prevalence increase. When we look at causation, there's a lot of interest in that area, a lot of research being done in that area, and right now the thinking is that really there's a genetic factor in combination with environmental and biologic factors. So there's not one thing that causes autism. Certainly the research has clearly shown, as a few years ago it was very popular to think that vaccines caused autism, but there's no research to support that. It's more likely a very complex interaction of many factors. Additionally, so the folks that are coming into your libraries, most likely if you have a person with autism, it will be a male. Males have autism at a much higher rate, 5 to 1, than females. Right now, there are about 3.5 million Americans that are living with autism spectrum disorder, and so the likelihood that you have people who use your library with autism or ASD and we'll continue to have folks with ASD using your library in the future. So a little bit about the statistics of autism spectrum disorder. Then I wanted to talk about the areas of difficulty. So when we talk about people who have autism spectrum disorder, it's what's called a hidden or an invisible disability. Oftentimes, folks with autism spectrum disorder look like anybody who does not have autism spectrum disorder. You just by looking at them, you wouldn't be able to say, yes, that person has autism spectrum disorder. Contrast that with the situation of a person who is blind. They have a service animal, or they use a white cane, so there's some visual indicator that there is a disability. That's not the case with people with autism spectrum disorder. So that's just to keep in mind that the interaction is where we might see some areas of difficulty. So when we look at diagnosis, we look at really three areas. We look at the ability to interact socially and greet, have conversations, those kind of skills. Those are usually difficult for people who have autism spectrum disorder or ASD. Communication is another large area that is difficult for folks who have been identified with ASD. And then a third area is that restrictive or repetitive behaviors. And I like this diagram because it represents the idea that while these three categories are distinct, there are also overlaps between all of those categories. So social interaction impacts and is impacted by restrictive behaviors. Same with communication. And so we're going to look at each of these areas more in depth and kind of tease out aspects of them, and then that will lead us into some tips and some tools that we can use to work with and to support people with ASD in our libraries. So let's start with social interaction. People with ASD may exhibit some limited social interaction, may exhibit limited eye contact. They may not respond to nonverbal communications that you would expect them to, a smile or a wave. The difficulty with interacting with others is it's not a willful social snub, so to speak. It's not an intentional misalignment of social interaction. It's just that difficulty with doing that. It's an inability on that person's part to engage socially with others in the same way that other adults or other children without ASD would engage. So sometimes when you're interacting with a person with ASD, they may look at the ground when you're speaking to them. That doesn't mean they're not listening and they're not taking in the information that you're giving them. It's that they have difficulty with the eye contact, or oftentimes people report that they feel like the person with ASD is looking through them, that their eye gaze is there, but it's not the same type of eye gaze as a person without ASD. I personally am very I use social nonverbal cues and social interaction cues quite a bit when I interact with people, and so it's disconcerting because you're so used to having those cues, and so we need to keep reminding ourselves. I need to keep reminding myself that it's a different way of interacting, and I can't expect that the same social interaction or interpretation of social skills will be provided to me. People with ASD may use very limited, few words, or very repetitive speech to communicate. Sometimes no words at all may be used. So, for example, my brother is pretty nonverbal. He uses what's called echolalic speech, so he'll repeat what you say to him, the last piece of what you say to him. And so that limits his social communication because he doesn't have the language to use. But oftentimes what he'll do and what others with ASD will do is use their behavior. So he'll go and stand by something to indicate his want to have it. So I can remember going into Walmart and him standing by the little little refrigerators that have soda or pop in them, and I was not very good at interpreting his behavior at that point in time, and I couldn't figure out why he wouldn't move from that spot, even though we had to get other things at Walmart and not pop. And so finally I figured out that his standing there was his communication saying, I want some pop, Mary. And so we got the pop and off we went and got our groceries, and everything was lovely after that. But sometimes when you don't have words to communicate what you want or need, you use your behavior to do that. Again, as I said, it may be that what we think is obvious communication may not be interpreted the same way. So for example, most of us know a fist bump is, as a high five is a indication of positive communication, but some folks with ASD may look at that as a punch rather than a fist bump, and so may react very differently than what we're expecting them to do. So social interaction is an area of difficulty for people who have autism spectrum disorder. The second area, and again, there's a lot of overlap in these areas, but particularly communication and social interaction. The second area that folks may find people with ASD having difficulty is in the communication area. Initiating conversation is difficult. Again, so it may be that a person comes up and stands within a communication space, a couple feet away from me, but doesn't say anything, but the behavior is saying to me, I want to initiate a conversation with you. I just don't have the words, or I'm not able to initiate that on my own. May not respond to greeting that you give to them, not because they're, again, being willfully antisocial, it's just a difficulty that they have. Maintaining conversation is often difficult as well, and so it may be that you ask questions but there's no response, or the response doesn't seem to fit the question very well. And so it may be that people with autism insert into dialogue interests of theirs that aren't necessarily on topic of what the dialogue is about, and that's their way of trying to join the conversation but not being able to join on topic. Language that's abstract, puns, idioms are very difficult often for people with autism spectrum disorder. So, for example, saying something's cool, that's very cool. The person may interpret that as a reference to temperature rather than to an affirmation of the goodness of the topic. And so we need to be careful about that potential for misunderstanding, because I know myself, I use a lot of phrases like that in my everyday communication, and not even being aware that there could be pose difficulties for people with autism spectrum disorder. The third area and last area that people with ASD have difficulties with is restrictive or repetitive behaviors. So oftentimes this is what people think of when they think of quote unquote people with autism. People with autism may be very focused on a particular topic. So for example, a middle school child may be very focused on jets and every type of jet and different military jets and engines that jets have and cruising speeds and all kinds of very specific information about jets. And that's that restrictive, narrowed interest that oftentimes people with autism have. Again, as that diagram showed, all of these areas of difficulty overlap. So if I have very narrowed interest, of course that acts my ability to socially interact with others who don't share those interests. Repetitive behaviors can also be a part of the challenges for people with autism spectrum disorder. Oftentimes what many people think about is those students that flap, or people that flap their hands back and forth, that repetitive kind of behavior, or spinning around, sitting in a chair that spins and spinning around. And those certainly are examples. Again, from my own experience, my brother, when he gets in my car, every time opens the glove box. So I have learned that I can't pack my glove box really full of stuff, because otherwise it comes tumbling out on top of him and the floor and everything else. And so those repetitive behaviors could be sporadic, but there's something that just it has to be engaged in. It's almost a compulsive kind of behavior. Another example, if you've seen the movie Rain Man, one of my personal favorites, I have to admit, the character Raymond Babbitt, the character that was played by Dustin Hoffman, every night before bed he had to eat cheese balls and drink apple juice. Again, that's an example of repetitive behaviors that people with autism may engage in. Oftentimes there are sensory issues for people with autism, and those sensory issues can be displayed in some unusual behaviors or unusual responses. So sounds, smells, touches can be accentuated or minimized for some people with autism. I've known many people with autism that tags in clothing are unbearable, that just that little bit of input on the back of their shirt, that's a tag. They can't disregard that. It just makes it unbearable. So I know many mothers who are very appreciative of Hanes tagless underwear, and I always wonder if they produce that line based on some feedback from people with autism. I don't know that. So we have to be aware that sometimes some input that we don't think about, or it doesn't even enter into our awareness because it's just not at that level for us, may be very difficult for people with autism to ignore and to tune out, and then that causes some behavioral responses. Kind of get an idea of that, I wanted to show a very short video, and what I'm going to need to do is take out my headphone mic so that you can hear this on my computer. So I'm hopeful that this will work. We'll watch a short video on processing sensory input. So I hope now you can hear me again. Is the audio okay?
Hi, Mary. Yes, I can hear you fine. You might want to speak just a little bit louder.
Okay, thank you. I will
Gotcha. Okay.
do that.
Okay, thanks, Mary.
Okay, thanks, Louise. So just to get a sense of, most of us don't hear the clicking of the ticking of a clock or have that sound reverberate in our head and have it affect the way that visual stimuli come in. And so I thought it was a really good video to help us think about how it might be to have different sensory experiences and how that may cause us to want to shut down and leave the environment. That's kind of that idea of unusual responses and sensory input. And another little piece of sensory input, that was accentuated sensory input, but the opposite is also true. It can be that sensory input doesn't come in, so it's a reduced level of sensory input as well. So I'm going to stop for a minute because the next section of the presentation goes into kind of the tools and the tips, things that we can do based on the characteristics that we've just talked about. And I think Louise is going to help me with some questions if you have any. So take a minute, and if you have any questions thus far, please feel free to type them in the chat.
Yep, I haven't seen any questions come in yet, Mary, but if we
Good.
want to give everyone a minute, we'll see. Well, you must be addressing everybody's concerns so far, so
All right.
when you're ready, we can break again for more.
Okay, that sounds perfect. Thank you guys so much. So again, what I want to do is take those characteristics that we talked about that are the defining characteristics of autism spectrum disorder and talk about what tools can address those characteristics. How can we have some tips, some techniques that we can use so that people with autism, and in fact, these tips help many people with disabilities, they can access the great resources that are in our libraries and participate with folks without disabilities in the library. So the first thing, this is a foundational tool, and it's using people first language, and I'm not sure, this may be an old concept for folks. It's been around for quite a while, but it's that idea that we want to talk about folks as people and then at the characteristics that they have as a person with autism or a person with a visual disability or a person with Down syndrome or in any other kind of difference that we're talking about. And so trying to really frame the conversation around recognizing that all of us are individuals or people first. So the label is quite concrete about it. So for example, you would say, if you're using people first language, you would say the man who uses a wheelchair versus saying a wheelchair bound man. And I know sometimes when I'm watching television, people first language is used. So I know that that's a very common thing, but it's just trying to keep in our head that we want to look at all individuals as people. Another example is how we would speak of people that have autism. We wouldn't refer to a young adult as an autistic girl because that's saying her autism defines her, and actually it doesn't. She is a person, and then she has this characteristic or these characteristics that are called autism. We would instead say the girl with autism. So it's that idea that we want to make sure that we're respectful of the individual. And I will tell you, I have to continually think about this, and I've been working in the area of special education for a very long time. I think the other piece of using people first language is that idea of disability as a disease rather than a difference. And this is something that is debated, but I think the disability advocacy community would say that disability is about differences in how we navigate the world, differences in how we interact with people, differences in how we process information. It's not a deficit or a disease. So, for example, saying that someone is afflicted with autism is really sending the message that it's a disease, that it's a deficit. And while there are difficulties that characterize disabilities, it's that fine line between the way that we perceive disabilities. In fact, some families who have children with autism refer to their children as neurodifferent. So taking autism, that label out of it, and just saying neurologically they process information differently. That's not the diagnosis that's made, or that's not the category that many of the statutes are written around, but it is a way to think about it as a difference rather than a deficit. It may seem like it's wordplay, a semantic game, but really it's just trying to think of people with disabilities, people with autism spectrum disorder as different, as interacting differently, that they're able to interact with the world, they're able to do things, it's just in a different way. It's not that they are unable to interact with the world or unable to be successful at life. So using people first language and conceptualizing disability as difference rather than deficit or disease are all those foundational steps that support all people using the libraries and the very rich resources that they have available to them in our libraries. So that being the foundation, then, let's look at some tools for the specific areas of difficulty that people with autism spectrum disorder often have. So social interaction was the first area that we looked at. And thinking about a difficulty with typical social interactions, we then need to take into account the behaviors that may be exhibited by people with autism spectrum disorder, and then how we respond to those behaviors, those ways of interacting. While there's not a typical person with autism, and one of the parents you'll see says that, these are common characteristics, and so we can't say that every person with autism doesn't give eye contact, but it's a characteristic of many people with autism. So we're making some generalizations here, knowing that it doesn't apply to every person that we will encounter who has autism spectrum disorder. So people with autism may have some difficulty, or may have difficulty with reading social situations and interacting in a typical manner socially. So someone who's reluctant with social interactions, we can approach, quietly. We can slow down our approach, not expect that they're going to respond in the same way, respecting their personal space. So again, saying for myself, I'm a very, I am physical. I touch people that I know when I'm talking to them. I, put my arm around their shoulder. I try very diligently to hold back my, natural instinct or inclination to to touch somebody's arm or shoulder, or when I'm talking with folks with difficulty with social interaction. We have to give them their personal space. Some people need more personal space. Some people with autism need less personal space. Again, that's that varying level of where their social interaction skills are. So we have to read the cues that the individual is providing us based on the reactions that they're having with what we do. So approaching quietly, accepting that they may not give us eye contact, that we can continue to communicate, knowing that they may be taking in the information even though they're not looking at us. If a child if we want to watch for their understanding of social cues, they'll tell us by their behavior what they're, how they're interpreting what we're doing. So if we approach a child who has autism spectrum disorder and they back away, then we know that that's communicative. That behavior is telling us that we've gotten too close, that their social interaction skills don't want that physical proximity that we're giving them, so we need to back away. I can get down to the person's eye level and not stand above them and talk down to them, but get down, crouch down, or sit down, so that it maximizes the ability to have some eye contact, even though I may not get much eye contact. I'm in that line of sight, and the person doesn't have to look up at me to give eye contact if they want to or can. Again, I want to be very respectful communication and not expect that they'll gaze lovingly into my eyes when I'm communicating with them. If I know that person's name, I'll use it when I'm greeting them. They may not respond to a greeting, but I want to make sure that I use the name so that any cues that they can pick up on that I'm addressing them, that they can. So using their name, getting down and being in their space, trying to provide easy eye contact. Again, being very aware that if I use a gesture such as a thumbs up, they may not know what that means, and so I may have to say specifically and concretely what I want to communicate. So, you're in the right section of the library for the books that you want. Rather than giving a thumbs up, I'm going to say that's the right section. Short communication, being very concrete with that. We have to, as that first quote said, all of these things help us enter their world so that we can more successfully communicate, or increase odds that our communication is going to be successful by entering the world, by knowing the characteristics of some social interaction difficulties, and then trying to help support them through our behavior by what we do to get better social interaction. So then looking at communication, the area of communication that is the second area that we can think about in terms of adjusting what we do and how we respond to people with autism spectrum disorder. Again, those circles were overlapping. It's really closely aligned with social interaction because most of the time social interactions are verbal communications, not always, but a lot of the time. So many of the tools overlap as well. I talked about concrete language. Again, is difficult. Now, jargon in a person with ASD's area of interest, they'll go with it. They probably have more jargon in that area of interest than you or I would have, but jargon that we may think is typical or most people would understand may not be. So it may be, fiction, nonfiction is, most people understand that nomenclature, but a person with autism may not, and so you might want to ask them if they want to find books on history or transportation or some really concrete informational texts that then they can understand where you're pointing them in the library. Again, if I know that person's name, I will use it because then I am increasing the cues for the person to know that I'm speaking to them. Again, trying to minimize idioms or phrases that are not concrete, like cut to the chase or way to go, are things that might not be understandable by people with autism. As I mentioned, my brother is pretty nonverbal. I mean, he's echolalic, like I said, he'll repeat, but most of the time he is nonverbal, and he has limited expressive language, which means the words that he uses or what the output, the language that he puts out to communicate is very limited. But I will tell you, he is typical of people who may have some expressive language difficulties. Oftentimes those folks have much better developed receptive language, so they understand what others are saying at a higher level than what they can express. So even though my brother doesn't use a lot of language, I can ask him simple questions or give him choices, and he understands that I'm asking him to make a choice about something, even if he has to point to the picture to give me the response or echoes back a response. So that receptive language is often higher, and people with autism spectrum disorder, those that have minimal language, can often understand things. So we need to be aware of that. As I said, my brother uses sometimes choices. You can point to things and say, which would you like? Many children use that kind of a process. There's often cards that children carry with them, or sometimes adults carry with them, that have choices that they can point to. We can also use pictures or props. You can go to an area of the library and point to what you mean to communicate, and see if the person responds to that. Again, watch behavior. So when a person may want to go to the informational text or area, and they walk towards that, and so thinking about why are they going in that direction, it might be because that's what they want to explore at that point in time. So using what you have, and again, it's not that you're going to array a bunch of props on the desks so that you can understand or try to communicate every possible situation, but just thinking about what's in the environment and how can I use different things that are in the environment as props, so to speak, to help folks understand or help you communicate with folks in some different ways. So restrictive or repetitive behaviors. This is the area I think that some of us, these are the tools that are oftentimes helpful for us. It's the area that, again, a lot of people think about when they think about people with autism spectrum disorder. Many of these I think about children, like ensuring safety, but it's true of adults as well, that we can use these tips and tools with all ages and all people who have autism spectrum disorder. So the first thing, and always, is that maintaining safety in the environment. Many children with autism are they're what we call elopers. They have a high risk for elopement. That means they leave the area. And I think about this in terms of that short video that we saw, and if that noise were going in your head and it just kept getting more and more and more distressing, you would want to leave that environment to get away from those noises. And so oftentimes that's a child's behavior in reaction to some sensory processing issues that they may have. So we have to ensure safety, and I know that that's already something that library staff thinks about. I just wanted to put it up so that we can, think about it again in this area and know that people are at risk for elopement. And the same with adults, that adults may suddenly leave the library, and to interpret that behavior as being upset with you or something else may be interpretation. It just may be that the stimuli got overwhelming. They just didn't, keep their self together, so to speak, and so they had to leave the environment. They often leave in an appropriate manner, though. The other thing with safety is if you encounter a child outside of the area where their family is, again, because of those communication skills, they may not be able to tell you their name or their parent's name or, where they live or any of that. So communicating that information may be very difficult. So just to be aware that we can't, with children who do not have difficulty with communicating at the level that students with autism spectrum disorder have, we can ask them their name, or we can ask them who they came to the library, or other kinds of questions that will help us sort out the situation, and that just won't be available or may not be available with some of the people who use our library who have autism spectrum disorder. So with, again, just like the video pointed out, trying to keep sensory stimuli to a minimum, although, we can't do that. Our libraries have visual stimuli, people are talking, people are ruffling through books or magazines, they are, doing things in the library, and certainly we cannot make a sensory-free, nor would we want to make a sensory-free environment, but just trying to think about how that stimuli might be affecting people, and trying to understand how loud voices may affect someone with an auditory sensitivity. And that, when I'm trying to communicate with folks, oftentimes it's good if we move to an area. So it may be that the library isn't where I want to, the general space isn't where I want to try to have a social interaction with someone with autism spectrum disorder. I may want to move to a smaller room with less distractions so that we can, use each other's cues to help us interact and to help us communicate. So being aware of that and being able to do that is important. In terms of restrictive behavior, in terms of acting out, repetitive behavior in terms of acting out, or inappropriate behavior, because oftentimes we do have people or children, young adults with autism spectrum disorder that become overwhelmed, and their behavioral response is inappropriate, yelling, screaming, maybe knocking over things. All of those things can be responses to inability to communicate or sensory overload or a number of things. And so trying for us to be very concrete and specific about prompts for affected behavior, or if we have children in a library group, this is a time to sit quietly. We expect that you will share the materials that we're working with, those kinds of things. Just kind of preemptive prompting so that it's very concrete and specific and says to the child, we're sitting now, we're sitting quietly now, or this is, there's a lot of materials at the center of the table and we're expecting everyone to share. Having visual cues, as I mentioned, many students with autism spectrum disorder or some adults use visual communication to help. So if they have that, using their own system to help prompt them for affected behavior. And I know it's very difficult to do, but as much as possible to try to ignore inappropriate behavior. So I worked with a young man who had those kinds of restrictive, repetitive behaviors, and he would call out, there's a monarch butterfly, there's a monarch butterfly periodically. methodically through different activities that we were doing. And it worked best, again, to give him those prompts beforehand. This is a quiet time, you need to sit quietly, but also to, as much as possible, ignore those statements that he was making, because it seemed that if I said, you need to sit quietly, and this is a quiet time, and you're disturbing other people, and lots of verbal interaction with that, it would escalate that behavior. Now, we can't ignore dangerous behavior. We can't ignore destructive behavior, but those small, repetitive, restrictive kinds of behavior, as much as possible, if we can ignore those, that would be great. The other tip for that is to ask families, if you can, what works for their child, or if someone would ask me, what works for my brother when he does X or Y, when he echoes what you say, how can we help him communicate? So just having that really brief dialogue with families about what works with their child, because they know what they do at home. They have strategies that they use. So oftentimes, in response to this sensory overload, people will melt down. So that's, the technical term of it, not really, but engage in inappropriate behaviors. And oftentimes there's strategies that families have set up that help with that. And trying to remember that behavior is communicative. By that I mean when the child is yelling or screaming or flailing, they're saying something. They're saying, I'm uncomfortable, or I've had enough and I can't take in any more stimuli. I auditorily, I can't process this, or you're invading my space and you're making me feel uncomfortable, or I can't sit anymore. I have to move. My body is telling me I have to move. Any number of communicative intent can be, but what happens is it gets expressed as inappropriate behavior. So just trying to keep in our mind that that's communicating something, and that we need to be calm, and we need to work with their families or whoever's with the person to help figure out what the best strategy is to help that person be successful. So I've mentioned a few times that we asked families what they would want you to know, what they would want library staff to know about working with their family members. So I have just a few quotes that I thought would be helpful for us. And this one speaks to that idea that there are a wide range of characteristics and the difficulties that people experience from the different areas, social interaction or communication, restrictive behaviors, is very wide. So there's very different needs and very different levels of functioning. So there are people who have autism spectrum disorder who are brilliant and do research or function in very high level positions. And then folks, such as my brother, who need support 24/7, that are not independent and need help with everything. And so that's a huge spectrum of functioning, and we just need to be aware that there is not one way that autism spectrum disorder is demonstrated. Another parent said that we should all try to be understanding and understand that sometimes children or adults don't know how to act or what's expected in a library. And so that gets back to that idea of restrictive behaviors and repetitive behaviors, and just understanding that that's a characteristic of people with autism. And then secondly, that idea of books related to autism and sensory issues, that families would love to have support from you, and many of you have that. And I think sometimes when parents report this or say this, it's not a lack of resources, it's a lack of knowing where to find the resources. And so just so you are aware, this is the perspective that parents sometimes have. And I think it's just an awareness issue. And then I really liked this quote, that it's not just the definition that you see on Google, that her child gets frustrated when he hears sounds like shh, and that goes back to that sensory processing and sensory issues, and that there are certain sounds that they'll react to. And several of the parents in different ways indicated that they feel judged, and I don't think that that necessarily is directed at library staff. I think the public, oftentimes when we see children having meltdowns, whether they're children with autism or without autism, having a meltdown in the grocery store, I know sometimes I go to this dark place of saying, oh my gosh, what is that parent doing, and why aren't they, doing something about that child? And sometimes if you think about a child who has issues all the time, and that daily things, things like getting a haircut, things like going to the dentist, things like going to the grocery store, taking your family to a movie, are very difficult and have to be planned and thought through, and always knowing that everything may fall apart midstream and that you have to regroup. I think that was a message that was so clear throughout the parents' input, and so just to keep it in mind for us that I don't think any parent comes into the parenting role saying, I want my child to behave horribly. I think parents are trying to do the best that they can, and parents or families that have members who have ASD have unique challenges, unique that they need to think about, and so we need to try to keep that in our mind. A couple more quotes from families, and I think, again, what they're asking is more books about autism, and books, I liked this, books related to maybe some odd interests that children with autism often like. And as I said before, I think this is more related to access. They don't know that their books are there, because I take my grandsons to the library and I can't believe the amount of resources that are there on some, every kind of animal you could ever think of, and every kind of science and planets, and one of my grandsons, you can tell, is informational text, and so I think it's an access issue more than, at least that's been my experience with libraries, more than actually having the resources. And then that idea of picture books, and again, I think there are a lot of picture books. I think that maybe we don't know how to access them as well as maybe we could. This one that I thought was interesting and I hadn't thought about before, but this parent said maybe having a sensory toys or a section of books with different resources. Again, that depends on your space and your environment and all kinds of issues, but just something to that this family member wanted to put forward for this audience. And the same from another family member, that, kind of a section. I think they do feel sometimes that they're bothering, quote unquote, other people in the library, and they don't want to do that. They want to enjoy the library, not be a bother for folks. So then just taking those quotes, taking what we've talked about in terms of characteristics, and consider these things. It may not be possible. It but considering, is there a space that can be used for a quiet time, for a time when you need to communicate and you need to pull a person with autism into a less stimulating environment, or a parent might be able to use that environment to help their child calm down and to help the parent communicate with a child, or a family member communicate with an adult. Looking at sensory toys, there's lots and lots available. Lots of toys that are just toys are sensory, squeeze balls, different kinds of fabric toys that have different feel to them. All of those are available. And again, you may have these in your library and parents may just not be aware of that. So it's an idea of how do we get the information to the people that need it. Getting to know your families who have members who have autism spectrum disorder, so that they can feel comfortable to you and you have a sense of what might work with those folks. Getting to know their interests so that, you know, if you have a chance to purchase and you have a less of a resource on monarch butterflies, like my friend I'm so obsessed with, being able to purchase those. Providing different seating options, and I know many libraries do this because I've seen it in libraries. In my local library, they have the kind of seats that are they're kind of a backrest that are just sitting on the floor, and then regular hard chairs, and then more comfortable chairs, and so there's lots of options. A lot of times that what's called proprioceptive input, that your body in space, how it's feeling, what it's sensing from how it's sitting, is important for people with ASD, and so having those options so that their body can feel comfortable so they can sit quietly and read or do other activities. And then you all know this, but just knowing the potential dangers and knowing that sometimes behavior can escalate very quickly, and it may be that books get taken off shelves or whatever. It doesn't mean that you don't have books on your shelves. It just means that you're aware of those kinds of potentials that can happen. And then just one last thing, and we'll go to questions. Temple Grayden is a very famous adult with autism spectrum disorder. She's a vet. And I like this quote, that we've got to work on keeping these children engaged with the world, these adults engaged with the world. They have so much to bring. And so however we can structure the way we interact and structure our environment, we help them be engaged with the world. So, questions at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Yes, we do have several questions that came in, so I'll just start with the first one. Kimberly asks, there was a point in recent history where ADHD was being massively overdiagnosed. Is there a possibility that we are looking at a similar problem for autism spectrum disorder?
You know, that's a really good question. A lot of the researchers think that because it is a spectrum, and I think that's the key, that you can have folks that, I mean, I can think about people that I know that in the past I would say they're quirky, and I'm using air quotes, I know you can't see that, but that probably would meet the official diagnostic criterion for autism spectrum disorder. So I think part of that is, because we say that someone has autism doesn't mean that they have the same level of autism as some others. So I think that's part of it as well. I'm not sure about overdiagnosis. I think it's more, and I think what the people in the field are thinking is that it's just that we are getting better at identifying that huge range of people that can be categorized as having autism spectrum disorder.
All right, thank you. The next one is from Cheryl. She said, my son has Asperger's syndrome, and she is trying to figure out how much to help him to find a job.
Oh, that's a really good, Oh, that tugs at my heartstrings. So I don't know if I have enough time to even answer this one. But for others, Asperger's, it used to be kind of a separate criteria. They've enveloped Asperger's syndrome into that spectrum. And I have to say, having been in the school system a lot in my professional career, we don't do a very good job transitioning students with disabilities into adult life, and that's, I think, what you're getting at. I think trying to work with strengths, areas of interest for people who have ASD, and seeing if there isn't a job match with their areas of interest. Sometimes it's very difficult to do, but having a really good transition, and I don't know how old this child is, but having a really good transition plan through the school is an option, and sometimes you have to work to get that.
Okay.
I don't know if that answered the question. That's a big question, and I appreciate you bringing it up because it's an area that we need to do much better at.
Okay, thank you for that. Tracy asks that there's a child with autism and their family who wants to check out over 100 DVDs, and that's kind of above and beyond library policy. And when they try to address this with the family, there's usually meltdowns, and so she's just wondering if you have any suggestions on how to handle the situation.
So the child pulls I would assume the child pulls all these
Well,
DVDs or materials.
not necessarily. Well, it's a little unclear. There's multiple people in the family. It sounds like one
Oh,
child has autism, and they can check out multiple, but even
yeah,
with what they want goes above and beyond the policy of the library.
yeah. I think as concrete as you can be with the child. So I don't know the specifics, but if could you use cues so that there's like a poster board that has 5 covered jackets or 10 covered jackets or however many of DVDs, so that it's very visual, very concrete. This is the number that you can get, and almost so that he could say or she could say, hold up the number that they have and match them. And if there's more than the number on the poster, you can't have those. So a very, very concrete cue that might help that child and the family understand this is the number right here, and here's the poster that you can use to help you choose which 10 you want or 5 you want or however many you want. But here's the cue. That may help a little.
All right, and just to follow up, it sounds like it's the parents that that
Okay.
don't agree as well. So that's part of it. So the child may
Yeah.
pull the DVDs off the shelves,
Yep.
but
Yep.
so.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I wonder if a cue would help even the parents, because it might be sometimes what happens is it's easier, it prevents the behavior, the inappropriate behavior, to just say, okay, have it, So at home, their strategy might be whatever the child wants, they get, because it's an easier strategy than trying to set up some other things. But maybe if you help the family realize that here, this cue may help, and stick to the limit. I mean, I know that sounds, I would stick to the limit and try to provide as many supports and cues to that child to say this is what you can do as possible.
All right. Okay. The next question you may have addressed already, but I'll ask again just in case people need some clarification. It says, as far as ignoring inappropriate behavior, how do we make sure the behavior is safe for other kids? Say in a story time, what if they suddenly become aggressive? How should the facilitator react, or what can be done to help the disruptive child settle down?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I do want to really emphasize that in no way should we ever ignore behavior that causes safety issues. You can't do that. That's our primary purpose, is to keep children safe, and so we can't do that. But what we might want to think about is, again, providing visual cues. So it may be that a lot of times we use a lot of visualization with kids because the words are more difficult. Auditory sometimes is more difficult. And so it may be as simple as having a laminated picture of sitting quietly of that child. It's really good to get pictures of the actual child or of a child sitting quietly. I would also work with the family and see what the family does, but it may be a case where there has to be another adult that comes and helps remove the child, and if you can't remove the child, then you move the other children away from the child who's maybe hitting or biting or kicking or whatever they're doing. So you have to separate that child from the group however you can do it, either moving him or her or moving the other group away from them. But I would try to provide some cues prior to that meltdown, and also try to figure out what the trigger is for the meltdown. Is it that he or she can sit for so long and then it's 2 minutes and then I'm done, I melt down, or what's the issue if we can get any idea of what's causing that meltdown or why, and then trying to stop it. So if it's a period of time, like I can sit for 2 minutes and then I just can't handle any more sitting, my body's got to get up and move, then we know that after 2 minutes somebody's going to have to take the child for a walk or do something with them so that they aren't sitting and then they get to where they can't handle it.
Okay. Next question is, when working with an adult with autism, how do you interact with them in a positive way? Mm-hmm. For example, we have had a person who calls multiple times on the phone and has a hard time explaining what he needs. And when the library staff ask him questions, he feels that he's being conspired against and may not be listening or he talks over the staff. Mm-hmm. So do you have suggestions on how they can interact with him in a more positive way?
Yeah, and over the telephone is really, really difficult because, you're not getting the cues. He's not, obviously, and he may not be able to use, but you as the person who's trying to support the communication is not getting any cues about how he's reacting and what he's doing. All you're getting is what he's saying. And so I'm wondering, one thing that I would think about is there a way that he can come in, or that somehow that can be an interaction where you can get some cues about what's going on with him. The other thing is he able to navigate your website, and could it be that you provide information on the website for him, or an email, or take that verbal communication out of it so that he's not interacting in that's a really lopsided communication for him. So somehow taking that telephone piece out of it, either by in person or some kind of electronic communication or something like that.
Okay. Next question. We've got a few more here. I think we're doing okay on time. So the next question is, should story times be limited to only children with ASD and not include other children with other disabilities?
This is a very personal opinion, so I'm going to preface it by that. I very much believe that our world is integrated, that people with disabilities interact with people without disabilities all the time, everywhere in our world when we get out of school. And so I think we ought to try to help everybody understand each other starting from a young age. And so I don't think a story time with just ASD kids helps them develop some coping skills or helps other children develop coping skills to work with every kind of person. So that's my personal opinion.
Okay. How can we help other people understand children with autism?
Oh, that's a great question. That is such a great question. I think having materials awareness that all people can see, having those resources available so all people can see it. I think, um, and explaining, if someone questions us, trying to explain some of the concepts that we've talked about today, like, you know, that person has a little bit of difficulty with sounds, and so they're going to go over to that area. Or I think just on a day-to-day basis, trying to be respectful, show respect, and then try to help other people see that people are different and that they react differently, and different isn't bad.
All right. This one's about story time. Does providing seating options in story time that indicate a specific area or space for each child help, or are they unnecessary since movement is so common?
And this sounds so, it depends. It depends on the children. You know, if you think about the quote that the one parent told us, that it's just such a broad spectrum, some students, I think that consistent seating and consistency of where they are would help. Some students that's not going to be helpful for, some children that won't be helpful for. So I think it's knowing who you have, and again, talking with their family members and seeing what they suggest for that. And I'm a believer in if we think it's going to help, if you think having a consistent seating arrangement and consistent seats for different students, because you've kind of watched them and you know their pattern, try it and see how that goes. And if it goes well, I would continue. It's a lot of things are trial and error, unfortunately, but I would try what you think might work, and if it doesn't go well, then that's not going to work.
All right. The next question is, my library would like to develop a story time for children on the autism spectrum. How do we find families without invading anyone's privacy?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's often, and again, I don't know the communities, because it does depend on the community, the size of the community, and where you're located, but a lot of communities have some parent organization. So there's oftentimes a chapter of Autism Speaks, or there's a local chapter of another organization. So you can do some exploring and then talk to the board or the president, or if there's if they're more formal and large, sometimes they have staff. But contact parent organizations in the community. The other way you can go is contact school and say, talk to the special education or the pupil personnel services division of your school system and say, we want to do this for our families. We think it's would be beneficial, and ask them if they can get a message home to parents, so it is not identifying families, but it's getting the message to the right people. So I would recommend either family organizations in the community, and if there's not that, trying to connect with the schools and seeing if they can help you get your message out, and putting it on websites and anywhere else you can put it.
All right, great suggestions. Often we have teens and adults with autism come into the library without a guardian. Are there some tips for helping them?
That's really true. Good question. So again, I think I would just think about, those three areas. So there's likely going to be difficulty with interaction, with communication, and with restrictive or repetitive behaviors. And using those same kinds of skills. Don't expect that they're going to respond to you. If you say, welcome, I want to help you, what do you want to do? They may not respond to you, and knowing that you may need to simplify your language, that you may need to ask, restricted questions. Do you like to read stories, or do you like to read books about history or transportation or whatever? So giving them some options that are really concrete, and then helping gently guide them in that direction if that's what they want, or letting them take the lead, and if they need help, being in proximity so they know you're there, but not being overbearing with them. Because again, there's a wide range. There are teenagers with autism spectrum disorder that would be able to use the library better than I would, be able to use the computer services better than I would, be able to find books better than I would. And so they may need no support at all. But just being aware of those individual differences and then those 3 areas that they may have challenges in.
Okay. Just a couple more questions here. How do you get families to open up on their child's needs so that we can accommodate them? Some parents do not want to admit that there's something wrong.
Yeah, and that's a pretty common. Good for you for noticing that and being respectful of that. I think the first step is to show respect to their child and to them. And so, trying to use some of those tips, watching the child and being aware of what might be difficult for them and not trying to invade their space and not trying to overload them with sensory stimulation, all of those kinds of things. So being respectful, and if you show that you're respectful for their child and respectful to them, and then, maybe asking them, is there something that we as a library staff can do to support your family, and not maybe point out the child, but the family. We want to be service to all our families. You want to support all your families, whether they have a member with ASD or not. And so that's a question that, you could be asking anyone. How can we better support your family? And just trying to show that respect. And it may take a lot of time because, unfortunately, a lot of negative messages that get sent verbally, non-verbally, all the time to families who have a member with a disability. I mean, I can't tell you how many stares and looks that I get when I go out with my brother, because he isn't one of those people who has an invisible disability. He has some other issues that go on with that. And it takes a lot of courage just to keep going out in public and keep doing it, because it would be much easier not to. And so I think just being aware that there are lots of negative messages that these families have gotten, not even in your environment, and that they come with all that baggage to your environment expecting that they're going to get the same negative messages. And it's just hard to trust, I think, and hard to open up. So just being respectful and letting it build.
All right. The next question is, I am a solo high school librarian with several daily visitors with ASD. Many times an aide is not available. Some familiar restrictive behaviors keep the students at the circulation desk for comfort's sake, asking me the same questions repeatedly each period. How do I balance the need to show the student kindness and respect while at the same time waiting on the other students, which could be as many as 35 to 40 teens?
Boy, that's a really good question, and thank you for wanting to show that respect. So I wonder if is there a way that you can take you out of the equation? So I'm not sure what the questions are, but is there another resource, or can they be used? I mean, I understand the comfort level. Is there a resource that they could use by your desk that they wouldn't necessarily be asking you the questions? And again, I'm kind of shooting in the dark a little bit here, but is there a computer that they can look up call numbers, or is there a computer that they can look up resources, or is there, so it takes you out of the dialogue, and they're dialoguing with something else. Or the other option is to say, okay, you answer this question by doing X and Y, and the last 5 minutes or 3 minutes of this class period, you and I can talk about it, so that there's a set, they know they have a task, but then there's a set time that if the reinforcer for them, the thing that they want is interaction with you, you have a set time to do that. And I understand you are pulled in 100 directions in a high school library, and I understand that. But is there a way that you can block off a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes that they get, but they have to use some other non-you resource during the other time, so that you can help the other people and let them know it's because there are other people that need help as well. And so I really want to talk to you, and I'll make time to talk to you at the end of class period or the beginning or whenever it is.
Anne had asked that question, Anne Marie, and she had just piped in and said that the set time may work as a goal, and thanks you for that. So,
okay.
All right, and then the last question I have is, what do you expect in the way of responsibility for caregivers bringing adults with ASD to the library?
That's a hard question. I think that they do have responsibility. I mean, I think we have responsibility for those that we are caring for. I do know that there are differing levels of skills in caregivers. I know that from my own experience with my brother, and so that's a difficult position because oftentimes caregivers, if they're paid caregivers, they aren't paid very much, and so it's difficult sometimes to get folks that have a high commitment. But if there are issues with particularly a paid caregiver, I think whoever is responsible, ultimately responsible for that adult, should know that there are troubles. So for example, my brother, lives in a home with other people sponsored through a local agency. And so if I had difficulties with his caregivers, I would go to the agency and say, we're having this and this problem, what can we do about it? How can we work this out? Now, if caregivers are family members or that, I think that's a little more tricky because oftentimes it's a lack of skill, I think. I don't think family members intend to go out and say, I want my family member to be inappropriate and I don't care how they, disrupt an environment. I think they don't know. They don't know what to do, or they just are worn out from trying to do the best that they can do. And so I think trying to have a respectful dialogue with family members about how can we make this a good experience for you, but for the other people in the library, which is only appropriate. The library is public, and so it's to serve everyone.
All right, that's all the questions that I see that came in. Thank you again so much for your presentation today, Mary. I think it was really informative, and we had a great group of people out there.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
And thank you, Louise, and thank everybody that participated. Those are great questions, and thank you so much for all of the work that you do for people with disabilities day in and day out, because that is so important, and I know that people often don't get recognized in service positions such as library staff. And so from my perspective, I just want to say thank you for everything that you guys do day in and day out.
All right. All right. Well, I guess we've come to the end of the webinar, so thank you again, Mary. And I also appreciate, again, I just want to say thank you for letting us record this in case anyone wants to refer to it later or couldn't join us today. So I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you, everyone, for joining in, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.